I have major updates on the Olympic ice dance scoring controversy that's led to outrage over the USA being robbed of a gold medal. New reports show the French judge accused of favoritism has a history of questionable scoring, and it does not look good.
Something strange happened after the Olympic ice dance final in Milan. At first, the millions of viewers watching the broadcast across the United States and around the world did not notice a single thing out of the ordinary. The arena was still buzzing with that electric, intoxicating energy that only the Winter Games can produce. Cameras were flashing from the stands, the ice was covered in flowers and stuffed animals, and the massive digital scoreboard hanging high above the rink displayed what appeared to be a perfectly normal, though heartbreaking, Olympic result. The silver medal went to the United States. The gold medal went to France. For a brief moment, it seemed like just another conclusion to another fierce contest on ice. But when the detailed judging sheets began circulating through the close-knit circles of skating analysts, coaches, and journalists, a very different and deeply troubling picture slowly surfaced. In figure skating, the numbers tell a story that the naked eye often misses. 5 of the judges on that panel examined the performance delivered by the American team and believed without any doubt that they had done enough to win the Olympic gold. But one judge disagreed, and that single, solitary set of scores altered the course of figure skating history. The margin between gold and silver on that frozen stage in Italy was just over a single point. In the incredibly detailed and precise world of ice dance, every tiny component carries enormous weight. A slightly deeper edge on a turn, a fractionally higher grade of execution on a rotational lift, a minor adjustment to a program component score. These are the invisible metrics that casual fans never notice unless they study the mathematical breakdown long after the television broadcast has ended. But this time, analysts did study it, and what they found sent shockwaves through the sport. One judge's scoring stood far outside the range of the rest of the panel. It was not a slight difference of opinion. It was a dramatically and inexplicably different evaluation. Suddenly, the entire conversation surrounding the Olympic final shifted from celebration to suspicion. What had looked like a routine, though agonizingly close, result began to feel profoundly unsettling. The International Skating Union, the governing body of the sport, quickly stepped in to defend the judging panel. Senior officials calmly explained to the press that variations between judges are simply a normal part of figure skating. Technically, they are correct. Subjective sports, by their very nature, always allow room for human interpretation. But to the American fans who had stayed up late into the night watching, and to the experts who knew exactly what they had witnessed on that ice, the official explanation felt hollow. Still, the quiet roar of that discussion never really disappeared, because only a few short weeks later, another entirely unexpected development followed. The reigning world champions, the undisputed leaders of American ice dance, Madison Chock and Evan Bates, quietly vanished from the official entry list for the World Championships in Prague. There was no dramatic retirement announcement on television. There was no tearful press conference. There was no carefully arranged social media farewell tour. There was just a simple, silent update to the competition roster. Their names were simply gone. For the casual fans who only tune in every 4 years, it looked like a normal post-Olympic break. Skaters often end their seasons early after the grueling demands of the Games. The Olympic cycle drains absolutely everything from these athletes physically, mentally, and emotionally. By the time the closing ceremony, fireworks fade into the night sky, many of them are running on empty with nothing left to give to the ice. But the people who had followed Madison Chock and Evan Bates for years, the ones who knew the struggles they had endured and the heights they had reached, sensed something very different about this moment. They knew that with Madison and Evan, the story had never ever been simple. Long before the Olympic medals, long before the back-to-back world titles, long before millions of Americans recognized their faces on television screens and magazine covers, there were simply 2 young, intensely determined skaters stepping onto the freezing ice together in 2011. They were inside a quiet, echoing rink in Michigan, trying to figure out whether a partnership between them might actually work. In the discipline of ice dance, raw athletic talent is never enough. You can be the fastest skater in the world. You can have the deepest edges and the most powerful knees, but if you cannot connect with the person holding your hand, you have nothing. 2 completely different athletes must learn to move as if they share the exact same central nervous system. Every single edge of the blade, every complex step sequence, every gravity-defying lift requires absolute, flawless synchronization. One hesitation, one poorly timed breath, one microscopic shift in weight, and the illusion they are trying to create disappears instantly. Because of this impossible standard, partnerships in this sport are notoriously fragile. They often fall apart within a few short seasons under the crushing weight of expectation, ego, and physical exhaustion. But from the very beginning, something about Chock and Bates slowly proved to be entirely different. Their training sessions stretched late into the cold, unforgiving nights inside those quiet Michigan rinks. The heavy, rhythmic sound of their blades carving into the ice echoed across the empty arenas while they repeated the exact same sequences again and again until their muscles burned and their lungs screamed for air. Their coaches stood by the boards watching carefully, their breath misting in the freezing air, searching for signs of that incredibly rare and special chemistry that separates the merely good teams from the truly legendary ones. At first, the progress came slowly. They earned small international podium finishes, making gradual, painstaking improvements. But it was their programs that began to attract a specific kind of attention. While many of their competitors focused almost entirely on the sterile mechanical precision of their footwork, Madison and Evan brought something entirely different, something almost daring to the ice. They brought theatricality. They brought Hollywood. Their performances often felt less like athletic routines and much more like short, gripping cinematic stories unfolding through movement. Judges around the world started to notice the strange, captivating presence of the American duo. Fans started remembering their names, and without many people realizing it at the time, one of the most enduring, complex, and beautiful partnerships in modern ice dance history had quietly begun. But what absolutely nobody could have predicted in those early days in Michigan was exactly how complicated and emotionally demanding their journey would become. Because the first Olympic moment they chased together, the dream they had sacrificed their youth to achieve, would nearly shatter their entire story before it truly had a chance to unfold. Long before the controversy in Milan, long before the world titles and the accusations of judging bias, there was another Olympic moment that nearly destroyed everything. It happened in February of 2018 inside the massive, brilliantly lit Gangneung Ice Arena in South Korea. The Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang were already well underway, and the atmosphere surrounding the figure skating events felt incredibly heavy, thick with tension and international rivalry. Olympic years always carry a fundamentally different weight. The arena lights feel 1,000 times brighter. The silence in the building just before a skater takes their starting position feels suffocating. And every single movement on that ice carries the agonizing burden of decades of preparation. By that point in their career, Madison Chock and Evan Bates had already spent nearly 7 years building their partnership from the ground up. They were no longer the promising, wide-eyed newcomers from the Midwest. They had become legitimate, fierce contenders on the global stage. Their programs had evolved into something wholly distinctive. They were known for dramatic, breathtaking storytelling, incredibly unusual and creative choreography, and lifts that blended terrifying athletic danger with exquisite theatrical expression. Television commentators frequently noted how their performances felt like watching a Broadway play unfold at 20 miles per hour. But Olympic ice is a different challenge entirely. It does not care about your past. It does not care about your artistry. It only cares about the present moment. When their free dance began that evening in Pyeongchang, everything seemed to be unfolding exactly the way athletes imagine during all those years of solitary preparation. The opening edges were deep and impeccably clean. Their timing with the haunting music was razor sharp. Lift after lift landed with the calm, terrifying confidence that only comes from tens of thousands of hours of repetition. For several glorious minutes, the routine flowed beautifully. The American audience watching at home held its collective breath. A spot on the Olympic podium was entirely within their reach. And then, in the blink of an eye, something almost invisible happened. During a sequence of incredibly fast, complex footwork near the middle of the program, a sequence they could perform in their sleep, disaster struck. As they moved within fractions of an inch of each other at high speed, their skate blades clipped together. It was the kind of tiny, microscopic miscalculation that haunts the nightmares of every ice dancer. The effect on the ice was violent and immediate. Both of them lost their balance. Gravity pulled them downward, and suddenly, right there in the middle of their defining Olympic program with the entire world watching, they fell. The massive arena gasped in unison. The sound of thousands of people inhaling sharply echoed over the music. Olympic moments have a strange, cruel way of stretching time. What lasts only a single second on the ice can feel like an eternity when you realize exactly what has just been lost. Years of brutal training, endless flights across oceans, thousands of hours freezing in dark rinks, while the rest of the world slept. The fractured bones, the torn muscles, the enormous financial cost. All of it, absolutely all of it, compressed and destroyed in a single devastating instant. For the vast majority of teams, a moment like that becomes the ultimate breaking point. The embarrassment, the heartbreak, the sheer weight of the failure is too much to bear. Partnerships in ice dance are famously unstable. One Olympic disappointment can easily push athletes into heated arguments in the locker room, blame, and eventually separate paths. But what happened next on that ice in South Korea revealed something incredibly profound about Madison Chock and Evan Bates. They did not stay down. There was no visible panic on their faces. There was no anger. They simply got up. They reached for each other's hands, reconnected with the fast pace of the choreography, and they kept going. Every single step they took afterward required a level of absolute superhuman concentration. Every subsequent lift demanded that they completely block out the catastrophic mistake that had just ruined their childhood dreams. They finished the program with their heads held high, and when the music finally stopped, the applause from the crowd carried a slightly different tone than usual. It was not just admiration for the athletic performance. There was something deeply emotional mixed into the cheering. It was a quiet, heartbreaking recognition from the audience of how quickly Olympic dreams can be shattered and the sheer courage it takes to finish the dance. Later, when the scores finally appeared on the monitor, the cold, hard reality set in. The medal that had once felt so incredibly close had slipped entirely away. They were left with nothing but the long, quiet flight back to the United States. But this is where the story of Madison Chock and Evan Bates shifts from a tragedy of sport into a triumph of the human spirit. The fall in Pyeongchang did not end their story. It did not break their partnership. If anything, it quietly and fundamentally reshaped it. Because in the long, quiet years that followed that bitter disappointment, their relationship would evolve into something much deeper than either of them had originally planned when they first joined hands in Michigan. They were no longer just two teammates chasing pieces of metal. They were two people whose lives, souls, and identities were slowly becoming inseparably intertwined, both on the freezing ice and far away from it. And that subtle shift would eventually change absolutely everything about the way the world saw them skate. The years immediately following the Pyeongchang Olympics did not begin with dramatic announcements or sudden miraculous breakthroughs. At first, life simply returned to its grueling, exhausting rhythm. Training resumed at the crack of dawn. Minor competitions continued. Long, uncomfortable flights between continents filled their schedules once again. For elite Olympic skaters, the calendar is a relentless force. It rarely slows down, even to let you process an Olympic disappointment. But underneath the surface, something massive was changing. Sometimes, the most important changes in a partnership do not happen under the bright lights of a competition. They happen in the quiet, unseen hours. They happen during long evenings after practice while stretching on the cold floor of a gym. They happen during quiet conversations in empty airport terminals, or in the strange, echoing calm of empty rinks after every other skater has packed up and gone home. For nearly a decade, Chock and Bates had shared almost every single part of their professional waking lives. Early morning practices, intense strategy meetings with choreographers, endless, maddening repetitions of the same step sequences until their bodies moved on pure instinct. Over time, those shared routines began to blur the lines between the professional and the personal. A routine conversation after training about edge quality would slowly turn into a conversation lasting hours. A flight to a Grand Prix event in Europe turned into deep discussions about life outside the icy world of competition. Moments that had once been strictly professional started to feel intimately personal. Neither of them had planned it that way. In fact, in the high-stakes world of ice dance, romantic relationships between partners are often viewed as a serious liability. They can severely complicate the working dynamic. The pressure of elite sport already pushes athletes to the absolute edge of their emotional limits. Mixing personal romantic feelings with ruthless competitive expectations has torn apart more than a few highly promising teams. When you are fighting for an Olympic medal, you need a partner, not a spouse. But with Madison and Evan, the exact opposite seemed to happen. The romance did not distract them, it grounded them. Their bond deepened into something unbreakable. On the ice, the change was almost immediately visible to anyone paying attention. Suddenly, their movements looked infinitely more relaxed, far less mechanical. The transitions between their complex elements flowed with a natural, easy grace that judges are trained to reward but can rarely explain on paper. The intense, magnetic chemistry that audiences had always sensed in their performances no longer needed to be acted out or carefully choreographed. It was real. They were not pretending to be completely captivated by each other. They simply were. The devoted figure skating fans noticed it first. The lingering looks at the end of a routine, the way they held on to each other just a second longer than necessary in the kiss and cry. Then the television commentators started mentioning it, hinting at the romance developing off the ice. And finally, the results began reflecting it. Free from the mental barrier of simply being co-workers, they began to skate with a fearless, intoxicating freedom. Year after year, the American team began to climb higher and higher in the global rankings. Their programs grew wildly ambitious, They fully embraced their theatrical identity, skating to everything from alien-inspired electronic music to seductive Egyptian snake dances. They blended terrifying technical difficulty with dramatic, character-driven storytelling that made them stand out like a beacon in a discipline where many teams play it safe with traditional ballroom routines. Small international victories rapidly turned into major podium finishes. World championship medals began appearing around their necks, and eventually the ultimate breakthrough arrived, the milestone that very few partnerships in the history of the sport ever achieve. 3 consecutive world titles. By the early 2020s, Madison Chock and Evan Bates were no longer simply another strong team in international ice dance. They had become legends. They were the defining American partnership of their era, carrying the weight of the United States figure skating program squarely on their shoulders. But something else was happening alongside their massive competitive success. Their personal fairy tale kept evolving. In 2022, they shared the news that millions of fans had been hoping for. After more than a decade of skating side by side, of enduring heartbreak and tasting ultimate victory, they were engaged. 2 years later, in 2024, they were married. It was an incredibly rare kind of story in the ruthless world of elite sport. 2 supreme athletes who had spent nearly half their lives chasing the exact same impossible dream, now continuing that journey, not just as partners but as husband and wife. And by the time the next Olympic Games approached, the narrative surrounding them had taken on the shape of a Hollywood epic. 15 years together. 15 years of 4 a.m., alarms, of chronic injuries, of missed holidays, of relentless, agonizing training. This was it. One final Olympic cycle. One final opportunity to step onto the ice and deliver the performance they had spent a lifetime preparing for, to finally capture the Olympic gold that had always eluded them. When the Winter Games in Milan finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Nearly everyone inside the sport, from the judges to the journalists to the fans in the rafters, believed they were watching the grand closing chapter of something genuinely remarkable. What nobody expected was how dark and complicated that final chapter would become. Because when the scores finally appeared in Milan, the warm conversation surrounding Chock and Bates would shift from pure admiration to bitter controversy almost overnight. By the time they arrived in Italy, their longevity in the sport was already considered a miracle. Inside the skating world, staying at the top for 15 years is unheard of. The physical wear on the knees, the hips, and the spine usually forces ice dancers into retirement long before they reach this point. Some partnerships rise incredibly quickly, capture a medal, and fade just as fast. Others struggle for years in the middle of the pack before finally giving up. But Madison and Evan had stayed at the absolute pinnacle of their sport long enough to see an entire generation of younger, hungrier rivals come and go, which is why the Olympic Games in Milan felt so significant. It was not just another competition on the crowded calendar. For many observers, it was the final farewell of a legendary career. When they took their starting positions for the free dance that evening, the massive arena immediately fell into a reverent, breathless silence. The first haunting notes of the music echoed through the enormous building. They pushed off the ice, and the opening edge sequence unfolded with a smoothness that felt almost supernatural. Every single movement seemed entirely calm, utterly deliberate, and impossibly effortless. This is a phenomenon that highly experienced skating fans occasionally notice when truly great athletes reach the very final stage of their careers, when they know they have nothing left to prove to anyone. Their performances sometimes carry a completely different quality. There is less tension in the shoulders. There is less frantic urgency in the face. It is almost as if the suffocating pressure of the Olympics has quietly evaporated, replaced entirely by pure, unfiltered joy. That night in Milan, Madison and Evan skated with exactly that kind of calm. It was a masterclass. The intricate choreography flowed from one dangerous element to the next, with a level of remarkable, invisible control. The rotational lifts rose cleanly and powerfully into the air, spinning at dizzying speeds before landing perfectly on the beat of the music. The required step sequences matched the rhythm with a level of mind-bending precision that only 15 years of shared experience and a lifetime of love can produce. For the millions of Americans watching closely, it felt like the single performance they had been building toward since that very first day in the Michigan rink. Even the veteran commentators trained to remain neutral began hinting at the magic unfolding during the live broadcast. One of them, his voice thick with emotion, said quietly over the microphone, almost as if he were thinking out loud, "This might be the greatest skate of their entire lives." The audience inside the arena felt it pulsating through the cold air. When the final note of the music struck and they hit their ending pose, the applause was deafening. It was immediate, explosive, and sustained. Thousands of people leapt to their feet. Cameras swarmed the two skaters as they stepped off the ice, their chests heaving and breathing heavily, but smiling in that very particular, radiant way that athletes do when they know, deep in their bones, that they have just delivered absolute perfection. For a beautiful, fleeting moment, everything in the world felt right. Because the dark memory of South Korea was still lingering in the back of everyone's minds. That devastating fall in Pyeongchang had cast a long, quiet shadow over their legacy. The sense that they had unfinished business with the Olympic rings had driven them for 8 years. Now in Milan, that ghost had finally been put to rest. They had skated the routine of their lives. And usually, when athletes reach that transcendent point, when the performance itself feels so complete and deeply satisfying, the color of the medal almost becomes secondary. But this is the Olympics, and Olympic competitions are not decided by standing ovations. They are decided by cold, hard numbers. After leaving the ice, Madison and Evans sat together in the kiss and cry area, their hands tightly locked together, waiting for the judges to deliver their verdict. All around them, their coaches stared intently at the monitors. Journalists leaned forward in the press box, holding their breath. The bright arena lights reflected off the massive video screens hanging above the pristine ice. The seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity, and then the numbers flashed across the screen. Silver medal. It was an extraordinary, monumental achievement by any normal measure. Most athletes train their entire lives and never even come close to the Olympic podium. To win a silver medal is to achieve athletic immortality. But something about the reaction inside the arena felt instantly strange, muted, and intensely complicated because the margin separating the French gold and the American silver was incredibly small. And it was small enough that when the complex judging breakdown was officially published to the media an hour later, a quiet, furious discussion began spreading like wildfire across the internet. It swept through skating media, flooded analyst circles, and dominated fan forums. It was a discussion that would eventually grow far louder and far angrier than anyone inside that arena could have predicted. Within days, millions of people were asking the exact same, deeply uneasy question. Had the best performance actually won, or had the system failed them? In the chaotic hours after the Olympic final, the atmosphere around the figure skating world felt unusually tense.